Ladies and gentlemen, if you came here expecting an epic tale of knights in shining armor, castles rising in the mist, and queens sipping from golden goblets while draped in jewels, let me take a moment to disappoint you gently. For tonight, we are not stepping into a medieval fairy tale. We are stepping into the real Middle Ages, and not just the Middle Ages in general, but specifically into the life of women who lived through it. And if you think history is boring, that's fine, because boring history is exactly what makes the best lullabies. So close your eyes if you like, but try not to miss the world we are about to wander into, where the role of a woman was often defined not by choice, but by circumstance, and survival was sometimes a triumph greater than any heroic battle sung by poets. To imagine what it was like to be a woman in the Middle Ages, you must first take yourself out of our modern world. Forget the ideas of freedom, individuality, or even basic rights that we so casually expect today. In medieval Europe, whether you were born into a peasant family, a merchant household, or a noble dynasty, your gender determined your destiny long before your first breath was taken. Being born a woman meant that much of your life was mapped out for you, your options were limited, and your value was often measured by your ability to serve others, be it your family, your husband, your lord, or even the church. For most women, life began and ended in the village. Imagine being born to a peasant family in a small thatched house of mud and wood, where smoke clung to the ceiling beams and livestock often shared the same living space. From the moment you could walk, you were set to work. As a little girl, you might help gather firewood, fetch water from a nearby stream, or watch over younger siblings. Childhood, as we know it today, barely existed. By the time you reached your early teens, you were no longer considered a child but rather a small adult with adult responsibilities. Girls as young as 12 or 13 were often betrothed, their marriages arranged to strengthen family ties, increase landholdings, or secure protection. Marriage, you see, was rarely about love in the Middle Ages. For women, it was about duty. As a wife, your role was to bear children, particularly sons, and to manage the household. In a peasant's home, this meant long hours of grinding grain, baking bread, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and tending the family's patch of land. You cooked, you cleaned, and you worked alongside your husband in the fields, often doing just as much labor as he did, but without the recognition. While men were recorded as farmers, craftsmen, or laborers in medieval documents, women's work often went unmentioned, as if invisible, even though it was essential for survival. Now, not all women were peasants. A small fraction of women were born into noble families, and at first glance, their lives might seem more glamorous. Castles instead of cottages, silk gowns instead of woolen dresses, banquets instead of porridge. But nobility came with its own cage. A noblewoman's life was also dictated by marriage alliances. Her father might marry her off to a man she barely knew, sometimes decades older than she was, in order to secure political power or land. Once married, her responsibility was to produce heirs to continue her husband's bloodline. Noble women were expected to manage vast households, oversee servants, and maintain the honor of their family. They were educated in etiquette, sometimes in reading and writing, but rarely had the freedom to choose their own paths. Education itself was a luxury. Very few women had the chance to learn how to read or write. For the majority, life was oral, knowledge was passed down through spoken traditions, skills taught by mothers to daughters. In towns, some merchant daughters received a bit more opportunity. They might help run shops or inns, and in rare cases, widows could inherit and continue their husbands' businesses. Yet even then, society often pushed them back into the shadows, reminding them of their proper place. Religion played a huge role in shaping women's identities in the Middle Ages. The church preached ideals of female purity, obedience, and submission, constantly holding up the Virgin Mary as the model woman, quiet, pious, and devoted. At the same time, the church carried a darker image of women, rooted in the story of Eve. Women were often seen as morally weaker, more likely to fall into sin, and thus in need of guidance and control from men. This dual image, saintly yet sinful, was a burden every woman carried. For some women, the convent offered a different path. Becoming a nun meant escaping marriage and childbirth, and in many convents, women were allowed to pursue education, engage in writing, and even hold positions of authority within their religious community. Some of the most remarkable medieval women, such as Hildegard of Bingen, came from convents, leaving behind writings on philosophy, medicine, and theology. Yet even in these holy walls, women were not entirely free. They still lived under the authority of male clergy, and their voices, however brilliant, were often silenced or ignored in the broader world. But let us not romanticize the convent too much. Life there could be harsh and restrictive. Poverty, obedience, and chastity were vows taken for life, and while some women found genuine fulfillment in this path, others were forced into it by families who could not afford dowries for marriage or who saw daughters as spiritual offerings. Imagine being a young girl with dreams of love, adventure, or even just a simple family, and instead finding yourself behind cloistered walls, never again to walk freely in the outside world. Now, there is another layer to the medieval woman's experience, the constant presence of danger. Childbirth was one of the greatest threats to women's lives. Without modern medicine, complications were common, and many women died giving birth. Those who survived often had to endure the loss of children, as infant mortality rates were painfully high. Wars, plagues, and famines also struck indiscriminately, and women, who had fewer rights and protections, were often among the most vulnerable. During the Black Death, for instance, entire families were wiped out, and women left behind had to fend for themselves in a society that rarely offered them security without male protection. Then there were darker times when women were accused of witchcraft. By the late Middle Ages, suspicion of women as agents of the devil grew, and countless women were tried, tortured, and executed for supposed sorcery. Sometimes these were midwives, healers, or simply outspoken women who did not fit into society's mold. The label of witch became a tool of fear and control, another way to remind women that stepping out of line could mean death. Of course, it wasn't all tragedy and oppression. Women were not passive victims of their age. Many resisted in small but powerful ways. They preserved traditions, raised families, and created community bonds that helped societies survive. Some women managed estates when their husbands were at war, effectively running large properties and even defending castles. There were queens who wielded political power, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who traveled, negotiated, and influenced the course of European history. And in the everyday lives of countless unnamed women, there was resilience, humor, love, and creativity that kept the medieval world turning. If you pause for a moment and think of daily life, you can almost hear the echoes of these women. The sound of a loom creaking as a woman weaves cloth late into the evening. The laughter of girls carrying water from a well, joking even as their arms ache. The quiet prayers of a mother at her child's bedside. The chatter of women in markets, haggling for fair prices. These voices, though often absent from chronicles written by men, filled the air of the Middle Ages. Without them, society would have collapsed. It is tempting to believe that being a woman in the Middle Ages was nothing but misery, but life is rarely so simple. Yes, the burdens were heavy, and the restrictions immense, but within those walls of expectation, women found ways to carve out meaning, to build relationships, and to endure. They found joy in festivals, in songs, in stories shared by the fire. They expressed themselves through embroidery, through food, through the rituals of daily life. Though silenced in history books, they spoke in the fabric of their world. So, what was it like to be a woman in the Middle Ages? It was to live in a time where your choices were limited, your body was not your own, and your voice was often unheard. It was to face constant work, endless duty, and the looming shadow of death through childbirth or disease. It was to be told you were weak, even as you carried the weight of survival on your shoulders. And yet, it was also to find strength in places where men never thought to look. It was to endure, to nurture, and to pass down life and culture, even when unrecognized. And as we drift into the sleepy rhythms of boring history, perhaps it is worth remembering that the story of women in the Middle Ages is not boring at all. It is the story of half of humanity, half of a world that has too often been erased or forgotten. Without their labor, their sacrifices, their silent resilience, the grand tales of kings and knights would never have been possible. To understand their lives is not just to learn about history, but to see the threads that connect us across time, to recognize how far we've come, and how much further there still is to go. And so, as you lay your head down tonight, maybe think of those women, not just the noble queens or the fiery saints, but the countless ordinary women whose names we will never know. Women who cooked, cleaned, gave birth, prayed, wept, laughed, and carried on in a world that rarely thanked them. Because in their quiet endurance lies a history far from boring, one that whispers to us still if only we take the time to listen.